Nowadays, women who are seeking to have a vaginal birth after a cesarean are the ones who can lead the way to a new childbirth conversation. Because I've been involved in childbirth conversation for 50 years, I know how we got here. And we got here because of consumer pressure, not because the medical profession was hell bent on having us have cesareans all the time. And I need to explain this to you so you know how to go forward. When I gave birth in 1970, there was a 4.5% cesarean rate, as I've mentioned before. They were only done for because a woman's life was at risk. We were cut from the pubic bone to our navel. We were knocked out. And it was a very serious operation, major abdominal surgery. And that's why it was very challenging for any of us to try to have a vaginal birth after a cesarean, because if we labored, our uterine muscles were cut in a certain way that it was dangerous in the way that they contracted. And we could have a rupture of our uterus on a very long scar, and that could be life-threatening to ourselves or our babies. And we were knocked out. So how did things change? They changed because modern women wanted to change. And it's as simple as that. Because I lived through that era, I can tell you what that change was. Big change was that we wanted our husbands with us, and they were allowed with us in labor and delivery, but if it was a cesarean, they weren't. The other is we didn't want to be knocked out. The medical profession had already begun to deal with the suffering of childbirth that's so prevalent in childbirth around the world. Women who lack skills, they don't cope, they don't manage. And because there's no way to know what your birth's going to be like, if you have a very short birth, it can be so intense you feel like you're going to die. But if you have a long birth that goes for days and days and days and days, they didn't know how to stop that. They couldn't do anything about it. The only thing they could do was to prevent the suffering. And they did that by giving women in modern cultures things like scopolamine or other just pain relief that made you feel horrible. So consumers wanted to change. We didn't want that scar on our belly because we were wearing bikinis. So the medical profession came up with a bikini cut. And we didn't want to be knocked out, so they came up with the spinal and then the epidural. And then we didn't want to labor with our twins or our breeches or other health issues that could be a risk to ourselves or our babies. So the medical profession came up with ultrasounds. And they came up with doptones. So we have to understand that the reason that we have a high cesarean rate is because we as consumers are risk averse, and we wanted the medical profession to respond to that risk aversion. So here we are now with 30% of women who have had cesareans. What's the most common cause of a cesarean? Well, when I gave birth in 1970, it was a mother's life was at risk. That was the cause. That's why cesareans were performed, and only reason. So, what's the reason now? It's because women have long first and second stages. So nobody wants women to suffer. If a woman isn't coping well with labor pains, the natural occurring labor pains, she looks horrible. She looks white or she looks red. She looks stressed. She looks terrible. And nobody wants a woman to suffer. So the medical profession has come up with epidurals so that you don't suffer. And if the epidural doesn't speed your labor along, or if you have a long labor, a long first stage, you are more likely to end up with a cesarean. You need to understand that the medical profession doesn't want you to suffer. And we as consumers don't want to suffer. That's what's called risk averse. When I work in third world countries where there's no medical care, people expect to suffer. They don't want to suffer. They just know that it's part of life. War is part of life. Famine is part of life. Hurricanes, snowstorms, all sorts of things. Abuse is part of life. We don't like it, but that's what it is. So modern people are where we are around birth because we were risk averse, and we asked the modern medical profession to respond to wanting to decrease risks. So here we are now. Now you want a vaginal birth after a cesarean. It used to be called a trial of labor, and that was more honest because cesareans are rarely done in second stage. although they're increasingly done because the natural birth movement rightly understood that forceps could damage babies. Well, why does anybody need a forceps? Because a woman's crotch is so tight. Why is a woman's crotch so tight? Because she has lacked the skills to prepare inside the baby's birth canal. So when we know how to prepare inside our birth canal from 32 weeks onwards, then the soft tissue of our birth canal is going to open up and we won't tear, we won't rip, we won't need to be cut, and our baby's second stage birth will not be delayed. And that goes for our pregnant body. Our baby has to open up the cervix, come through the bony pelvis, and then come down into the birth canal. If we're tight inside, if our baby is relatively large for our space and we don't know how to create space, we don't know how to soften inside, we get in positions because the labor pains become intense and we don't like them. So we get into positions that eases off the labor pains and we then hinder the first stage. And when we go on and on and on, like women did in 1970, just because 95% of us labored, it didn't mean that we labored for hours. We could labor for days. The medical profession didn't have any way to prevent that. And so if you labor for a long period of time, 24 hours or longer, everybody wants to help you and get the birth over with. And you're more likely to have a cesarean. And because forceps aren't being used now, they're more likely to push your baby up because you didn't have the skills to prepare your crotch. So we have to do something about it. The men and women who are working in hospitals now with COVID-19, they are freaked. They are freaked. These are your mothers, your aunts, your uncles, your sisters, your brothers. And you, as a person who wants a vaginal birth after a cesarean, absolutely must become skilled. And you must understand that this is your baby's birth. You got pregnant to have a baby, not a type of birth. So you have to have the skills to do this activity. You must prepare your body for childbirth. You must learn to open it up to let this big object out. And that's why fathers and mothers they were the ones who developed these skills. Fathers got it. Exercise and plumbing. Big object has to come out of a container. Okay, what do I have to do? Well, you have to help that container create space and to soften. It's not rocket science, but you need to do it. So then, how do you deal with labor pain? Labor can be very intense. It can hurt. What do women say? They say all the time, well, at the beginning of labor, it wasn't too bad and I didn't have any problem. Then the pains got more intense. Then it became more of a problem. Then the pains got really intense and I had trouble managing. Then the pains got really intense and I lost the plot. You shouldn't be able to lose the plot. You should have the skills to cope with that intensity. And that's why the term trial of labor was so right on, because you've got to get through it. And you get through it better with skills. If you're coping and managing well, then you change how the men and women around you see you and hear you. And this is what we learned back in the early 70s when these skills were developing, because 99% of the families who developed these skills were medically high risk. I have no medical training at all. We just knew that issues or risks could become problems, and we wanted to prevent them from becoming problems. And by preparing our body and by coping, we did several things. We made it easier for our baby to get out of our body more effectively, so we didn't have a delay in first and second stage. And second of all, we coped better. And what did that do to the men and women who were the birth professionals? They saw us coping better, which meant that the issues or risks that we had then could be more calmly assessed. If we were looking out of control, they almost didn't bother to calmly assess anything. They just wanted to help us not suffer. So when you're looking overwhelmed and you have risks, you're more likely to end up with more medical care and more likely to have another cesarean. So it's really important to you to understand that COVID-19 is pushing childbirth. You may go into a hospital where you do not have any support. And the good news is that no woman has anybody doing the birth for her. We all have to do it by ourselves, whether we are in the back seat of a taxi, by a rice paddy, or at home alone, or in a hospital where every one of our holes has a tube or a hose in it. We are the only ones doing the birth. So when Birthing Better families developed these skills, we did it to a commitment to work through the activity of our birthing our baby, because this is our baby and our birth. We didn't fool around. We developed skills that worked to help us cope and worked to help prevent issues and risks from becoming problems. Were we successful? Of course we were successful. I would not have spent 50 years of my life doing what families asked me to do, which is to carry these skills forward, if they were not incredibly successful. We share a common body language. If you're sitting there now and you have sit bones, the bones you sit on, you can open them up a little further. That makes space. You can inhale and expand inside your pelvis right now. You can exhale and soften inside your pelvis. There are so many skills that we don't know we need to know, and now's the time to change it. We need a high societal expectation that all expectant families self-learn birth and birth coaching skills, prepare their body, and use those skills as they birth their baby. Will you have a vaginal birth after a cesarean? I don't know. If you can get through labor effectively, and if the risks that you have do not present themselves, and you have prepared your baby's birth canal, then yes, you will have a vaginal birth after a cesarean. If you have risks that become a problem and you end up with a surgical birth, keep using your skills while you're being prepped and in surgery. This is your baby's birth. If you end up with a non-laboring cesarean, you may be delighted or absolutely pissed off. It doesn't matter. Use your skills driving to the hospital while being prepped and in surgery, because this is your baby's birth. And if you want to have a good birth story, it comes from doing this activity of birthing our baby, using competency and skills, and feeling dignified doing it, no matter what the challenges are. Now, will the hospital want you to have a VBAC? Yes, at this point, they really probably do. So you need to go in and show them how competent you are. It's so important. When I gave birth in 1970, multiple millions of women from the 60s to the 70s used Lamaze and Bradley skills. They weren't the best. They weren't fleshed out because they were the first group of skills, but they were skills. And then the natural birth movement came along, the new natural birth movement in the 70s and the 80s, and says skills don't achieve that natural pain-free labor with no medical interventions. So women just need to say no to medical care. Honestly, this has been a very confusing 50 years for me, because I have spent it trying to say to people, we need to have a skilled birthing population. Period. Full stop. And if people have choices, yippee. But you can't guarantee your choices are going to unfold the way you want, or even if you like them. So we need to focus more on a skilled birthing population, because this is an activity we do. We do it infrequently. It's life transforming, and it's a no-brainer, and it's not rocket science. It is not difficult to learn effective skills to help your baby come through your body and get it out, and to cope while it's happening. So there you go. This ranting old lady gets this opportunity to tell you, if you want a VBAC, then your responsibility is to become highly skilled. And those of you who are listening to my rant, please spread the word. We don't care whether people use our birthing better skills. We know why they're different than others. We just care that we have a skilled birthing population for all births without exception. Bye. See you later.